Where does one start when talking about Man of Steel? Does one address the extremely polarizing mess of a cinematic universe that sprung from its loins? Does one approach it from the question of how we got to where we are now from a movie that feels almost divorced from that universe? Does one ask whether or not the story of Clark Kent allegedly becoming Superman through his internal and external conflicts really works as a Superman movie? Or more simply, whether it even works as a movie, period? Honestly, I got no idea, but I might as well start with that last one because hey, simple is best, right? So, Man of Steel, reviewing the movie. This is happening now. And just to be thorough and fair, I'm not gonna go into that one point that Man of Steel shares with a lot of other things I don't like, cause I already made a whole video about that one, which you can check out. Also, fair warning, I'm jumping straight into the guts of the movie and assuming that anyone interested in this video has already seen it. Fine? Cool? Alright, let's go. I hardly think I'm breaking new ground when I say the biggest problem with Man of Steel is how it handles character. But to go into just how much is going to require some finagling, so have some patience with me. Man of Steel is a long film, and I really don't think it needs to be any longer, yet at the same time it feels like it's moving too fast for its own good at points. As an example, when Clark meets Jor-El and is presented with the Superman suit and he's flying around and junk, I can't help but think, already? I just feel like it was all forced on him. I've got a thing with origin stories, which is that iconic elements like the suit should really feel earned, if not by the character, then at least by the narrative. And I don't think that's what we have here. I have a similar problem with the way we use the name Superman. It's only done once in the whole film, and it's not done in any grand way, but rather tossed out casually, almost like a joke. It all works against what seems to be a real effort on the film's part to portray everyone as in genuine awe of Clark, when such staples of the character feel like they're being jammed in obligatorily. And that's not even going into how the suit feels especially forced, since it doesn't really gel with the aesthetic of anything else we see of Krypton. I think a large part of the reason the movie feels almost rushed to me is that it doesn't spend much of its time on real conversation. I can already hear what people are going to say. Zack Snyder is a visual storyteller, and neither he or screenwriter David S. Goyer are great dialogue guys. But I can't help it, almost every conversation in the film is either bald-faced exposition or flowery platitudes. When Jor-El gives Clark the suit and gives him that speech that accompanies the flight sequence, it doesn't feel like an honest moment between father and son, but rather Superman being given what he needs to be Superman by an all-knowing plot device. It feels very much like the priority with every dialogue scene involving Clark was just moving plot points and aesthetic elements along and not building his character. So when we're halfway through the movie, over halfway through the movie, 2/3 of the way through the movie, at the end of the movie, and I still don't feel like I really have a grasp on who the guy is, it just strikes me as though I haven't really watched all that much happen. This one scene where he's talking with his mom works, I think, but aside from the fact that he clearly loves her, is determined to help people wherever he can, and is conflicted over his heritage, what can you really tell me about Clark Kent as a guy? He's polite and courteous, which I do like, but he's missing something. You could make the argument that the traits I just listed cover all the necessary bases for your average incarnation of Superman, but I don't know, I just feel like if this movie is about this man, then I should feel like I know him better by the end. Henry Cavill is doing the best he can with what he's got, and there are some scenes where he displays a real rapport with other characters, like the scene with his mom, or even his final confrontation with General Swanwick, but I feel like that sense of rapport was needed far more often, and on top of that, boy do I have some problems with the writing in that Swanwick scene. Problems that go a long way to covering why I think this version of Superman hasn't gelled with a lot of people. I see what the movie thinks it's doing in this dialogue, reincorporating an idea that was seeded with Superman's conversation with a Catholic priest earlier in the film. The priest tells Clark that sometimes a leap of faith can be rewarded with trust and has to come first in any relationship. And so Clark takes that leap by surrendering himself to Zod for the good of mankind. The idea of faith in people to trust your good intentions is a very admirable theme, befitting of Superman, and Clark trying to pass that ideology onto Swanwick is the closest the movie gets to making good on the promise of Superman leading the world by example to be their best selves. Cavill plays it really charming, and I'd go so far to call it a great scene if it weren't for the frankly scary implications that it doesn't seem privy to. Namely, that this conversation happens right after Clark decided to use his godlike powers to wreck government property, worth $15 million in taxpayer dollars without consulting anyone. I mean, we realize why this is a problem, right? Superman asks that he be trusted to have humanity's best interest at heart, but to anyone who doesn't know him personally, I imagine what he just did would be evidence against that premise. Yes, the presence of the drone that he destroys is violating Clark's civil liberties, but there's never been a person alive like Clark, and there's no precedent for how to treat him. A big, showy display of power like this isn't doing Clark any favors. Why not just write the scene so that the surveillance drone isn't a thing? Make it closer to the immediate aftermath of the Zod fight. Have Swanwick walk up and say the government is called and doesn't know if they can trust Clark. Maybe say they're planning to build a drone to track him, and then have the conversation play out as is. Having it so that Superman waits until after he's destroyed his country's stuff on a whim, and then asks to be trusted makes him seem kinda malevolent. Who's to say that Superman doesn't destroy something else the next time the government does something he doesn't like? Who's to say what that something will be if it ever happens? If I were living in the world of this movie and I saw this sequence of events play out, that more than anything else would make me terrified of what the guy could do. Superman can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, demands public trust after barely making himself known to anyone, and exemplifies that he can and will punish any breaches in that trust however he sees fit, with no one to provide any checks and balances. It's a fine line to walk to avoid painting Superman as a burgeoning dictator, and this is just as bad as when the Reeve version decided to eliminate all the nuclear bombs in the world without asking anyone first. You know, this more than anything else might be why I can't fully grasp Clark's character in this movie. It seems like we're trying to play him as the all-American, trustworthy Boy Scout type, but then he'll do something like this, or some arguably even more heinous things that I'll get into, and it would be enough to make him seem like a monster if the movie was giving any thought to how it reflects on him as a person. It doesn't help that for as outwardly charming and expressive as he can be, and yes, that's admitting that everyone who says Superman doesn't smile in this movie is talking out of their bunghole, I really don't feel like I'm getting inside Clark's head and getting a sense of how he thinks about everything. I get the feeling the movie thinks it's accomplishing this through the use of flashbacks, but I really don't like how those flashbacks are presented in this movie. I really don't know what the film thinks it's accomplishing by having this story told out of sequential order, especially when the flashbacks are only pertinent to the scenes that they're nested in, half the time? The film opens with Kal-El being born, and the body of the story is Clark as an adult, but at random places we'll jump to him as a little kid, then him as a slightly older kid, then him as a young adult, then back to him as a slightly older kid, and there's really no reason I can think of not to just tell this story in linear order. This is especially true of the one flashback with the bus rescue, since, to paraphrase Folding Ideas, we already know what path Clark has decided to go down by the time we see his conversation about whether or not to use his powers with Jonathan. The question of what kind of man Clark will become holds no narrative tension and thus no purpose at all since we've already seen it answered. In fairness, I can at least read a little bit into the scene of Clark realizing his powers at school. Beyond setting up how the other Kryptonians are going to go through the same thing later, I interpret this conversation with his mom as being the root of Clark's determination and stalwartness. Although to avoid throwing the movie too much of a bone, I'm not sure I have enough to go on to say if my interpretation is correct. During the Smallville fight, Clark retroactively frames that moment as being about focusing on what he wants. What Clark wants, very obviously, is to help people, and while I may be reading a bridge too far and giving the movie too much credit, I like to think that it's that scene that informs why Clark butts heads with Jonathan so often, and ultimately disregards his concerns so that he can do good where he can. This all works well enough, but like a lot of things about Clark, it's unfortunately made less functional by Batman v Superman, a movie in which Clark very clearly doesn't know what he wants and seems to view helping people almost as a burden. There's also the impregnation metaphor that some people read into this film, this scene included, which I think is interesting and possibly intentional? I thought I might as well mention it since I was already talking about this scene and its swimming toward the island metaphor, but I don't think that reading the pregnancy imagery into the film actually makes it any better of a story. I don't think the idea of Clark as being reborn through his killing of Zod or his massacring of the baby trees or anything in the climax works at all, but I'll go into that more closer to the end. There really are a lot of places I could jump to from there, but hey, since I'm in flashback land, let's talk about this exchange.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
Maybe doesn't work. Maybe doesn't work even a little bit. And probably not for the reason you think. I get that Jonathan is a scared parent. Even if he has no reason to fear for Clark's physical safety, the idea that humanity might reject him outright is probably horrifying for a parent. But Jonathan is trying to actively discourage this kid from saving people's lives under the pretense that one day something big is gonna happen and Clark can't let himself be known until then, for some reason. Jonathan says there's more at stake than the lives of you and me and those around us. And I just, what is he talking about? Outside of those things, what else matters? Jonathan's whole argument for why Clark shouldn't save people rests on some incredibly vague sense of prophecy he has about what Clark is meant to do in the future, but it's never once made clear what he or the movie thinks that is. As I've already gone over, Clark ultimately ignores Jonathan and decides to keep saving people where he can even before Zod arrives. But let's pretend for a second that Jonathan didn't die in that tornado and that Zod never showed up. At what point does Jonathan finally say, "Okay, son, now's your time. Go shine in front of the world like I knew you were always meant to"? What is John waiting on to happen? It can't be an age thing, since Clark is very clearly an adult when they're still having this conversation. Clark says it's all about the fact that humanity just wasn't ready, but does Jonathan somehow know when this will no longer be the case? By the time Batman v Superman comes out, Clark is in his mid-30s, maybe even pushing 40, and humanity very clearly still isn't ready for him. So if Jonathan were still alive, just how long would he have had Clark sit on his gifts? Was he expecting some radical shift to occur in a matter of decades, and that somehow the world would be better equipped or willing to accept an alien deity in 2013 and beyond than they were in 1997? This is a big deal to me, okay, man? I don't understand what's going on in Jonathan Kent's head when he tells his son that his grand destiny might mean letting people around him die when he can stop it. The movie and BVS keep saying things like he saw what Clark would become, or that Superman was his dream, but it's never made clear if that's literal or just intuition. And that distinction matters because this character is gambling with people's lives. It makes Jonathan sound almost as bad as Zod, talking about the greater good. Except at least with Zod, I know what he thinks that greater good is. There are other thematic issues with this movie, of course. Videos by the likes of Geekvolution or Folding Ideas go into what I think is a big one, that being how the hope angle is handled relative to the baby trees. Zod's got a whole ship full of potential future Kryptonians, and Clark learning that he's supposed to be a beacon of hope for both Earth and Krypton, a bridge between the two worlds, is a huge part of his arc. If the great purpose Jonathan goes on about is meant to be anything solid, then that's it. Why then is Clark's thought process so simplified at the end as to treat it like such a simple thing to throw away one for the sake of the other? Yes, of course I want a Superman who puts people first, but this guy has been waiting his entire life to find his own people, and when we get to this moment...
Krypton had its chance!
and he kills all of the baby trees, I legit don't understand what's going on. I've watched this movie a couple of times now, and not once yet have I gotten a good explanation for why Clark doesn't just tell the Kryptonians he'll help them if they colonize another planet. Everybody just take a trip to Mars, or if you don't trust them that close to Earth, then another nearby solar system. I don't get why there's a rush to rebuild Krypton right now if they've waited this long, and I don't get why it has to be Earth other than the fact that that's where Clark is right now. I only bring it up because we get here and Clark aborts an entire species worth of unborn children after only a few seconds thought. The only thing on my mind is this could have been avoided if you'd thought to make a compromise at any point. Or, just use your brain. Am I missing something? Is there a reason it's gotta be Earth? Does anyone know? But anyway, now the idea of Clark as a bridge to connect the two species has to be entirely dropped, since Clark himself never really had any plans to let the two coexist. That's the kind of plot hole that an average Joe Schmo moviegoer would probably dismiss as nitpicking, but once you turn your brain on, it begins to break the whole movie, since the conflict then just comes down to Clark and Zod both being idiots. That said, and this is something I really didn't expect to feel coming out of my most recent viewing, but Zod himself is easily the best thing about the film. Michael Shannon is great, and his performance deserves to be in a better movie. Zod's interactions with Jor-El in the early part of the film show a lot of nuance in his face. Despite never seeing the two interact prior to this, I totally buy that they used to be close friends just because of how Shannon's face looks. The expression he gives after he kills Jor-El in the prologue is downright haunting. This carries through the whole movie, too. Zod's feelings toward Jor-El inform a lot of how he interacts with Clark, I think, and his scene with Jor-El's holographic consciousness toward the climax feels like it's between two people who used to have respect for each other but are now just fed up and can never hope to mend that bridge. Beyond that, Zod carries a lot of interesting ideas with him, and if I actually bought that neither he or Clark think to just restart Krypton somewhere else, then the idea of them clashing because Zod is genetically predisposed to the very sense of purpose that Clark struggles with would be really intriguing. Zod is a bad guy with genuine gravitas and pathos, which is something I can't say for any of the DCEU movies after this one, even Wonder Woman. He's got a real intensity, and lines like this one,
My soul. That is what you have taken from me.
managed to make the guy kinda sympathetic on top of everything else. Zod is a big part of why any of this movie works, if I'm honest, and he feels like the one character who had the most thought put into him. Someone who doesn't feel like they had nearly as much thought put into them is Lois Lane. Lois as a character sort of almost works. It doesn't work in her favor that one of her first and most memorable lines in the movie, the line about dick measuring, makes no sense in the context of the conversation she's having, and she mostly exists from there on as a plot device. What really confuses me in hindsight is what the movie thinks it's accomplishing by suddenly shifting to her perspective when she goes hunting for info on Clark. This movie is unapologetically Clark's story. It doesn't handhold the audience or try to ease them into the fantastical alien sci-fi stuff either, so why exactly do we start treating Lois like the viewer's eyes in over half an hour into the film? At this point in the story, we've already gotten as much insight into Clark's character as we're ever going to, and Lois' investigations and conversations with Perry White and sudden narration to the audience don't tell us anything about who she is, other than that she's determined to get her story published and feels indebted to Clark for saving her life, as well as curious about the mysteries surrounding him. All of which are things that could have been conveyed if her visiting Kent Farm was the very first time we saw her after Clark leaves her in the Arctic. I'm not saying don't ever give us Lois' perspective, especially if she's meant to be the proxy for humanity, but I just don't know what I'm supposed to be getting out of this stretch of the film. Why not dedicate that time to really building her relationship with Clark, instead of just having Clark say she's a friend after they've shared barely a few sentences with each other, and then saying a few more sentences before I'm suddenly supposed to feel like they're in love? Her and Clark kissing during the climax doesn't feel remotely earned because, as I alluded to earlier, most of their dialogue together has just been about moving plot along. Putting aside that the pair of them having a makeout sesh in the middle of 9/11 times 1,000 comes off as in kinda poor taste. I really don't know exactly what it is that they like about each other. Yes, Clark saved Lois's life, but even though she's clearly indebted over that, Amy Adams isn't playing Lois as enamored or anything. Clark has a charming enough demeanor about him, but I need to see more in the way of substantial character traits that they gravitate towards in each other, especially on Clark's end. What exactly is it that Lois does that takes her from friend to love interest in Clark's eyes? Not to mention the plot hole that everyone loves to complain about, why bring Lois onto the Kryptonian ship? Zod wants her to accompany Clark on board, and that's it. No reason why, Zod never talks about it, Lois never asks about it. Lois has some dialogue later that kind of implies that they probed her mind for information about Clark, but we never see that happen, and why would they need to do that when they can just probe Clark's mind? It's just an excuse to give Lois something to do so that she has a presence during a long stretch of the movie. It simultaneously still wastes the viewer's time because she's not adding anything to the story going on around her or interacting with Clark at all. The supporting cast are also largely just blank slates, the general, the scientist, the supportive mom, etc. Perry White is actually allowed a little bit of depth thanks to this scene, which might be the single best scene in the entire film. We try to do this reincorporation thing with Zod's right-hand lady Feora and this Colonel played by the guy from Law & Order where they tell each other that a good death is its own reward, and that would resonate more if there was more to either of those characters. I mean, I really can't even remember this guy's name, but we pose these two against each other as examples of humanity and Kryptonian, and we're meant to see the difference between them and how they act as the evidence that humankind deserves to survive where Krypton doesn't. On that level it works, but the problem remains that they and the rest of the cast don't feel like people to me. But hey, I mentioned earlier that Snyder is more of a visuals man. Unfortunately, I have my problems in that department too. I know that this is going to come off like I'm someone who just wants all their comic book movies to be really bright and colorful, but I'm really not. The aesthetic of Batman v Superman and Watchmen actually work pretty well for me, and 300 is very clearly doing its own thing, but unfortunately the Snyder film that Man of Steel is most visually comparable to is Sucker Punch, and that's not a good thing. The grayscale look of this movie genuinely starts to hurt my eyes after a while of looking at it, and I can't for the life of me understand why Snyder made that creative choice. Pretty much every moment that Clark is in the suit, I'm thinking to myself how amazing it would look if I could actually see the color on it as designed. Especially since the one thing Snyder can do better than anyone else is frame a shot of Soups floating in midair. I mean, look at this and tell me it wouldn't look way better, if not downright iconic, if the colors weren't so muddy. I can't help but feel like it's this palette that makes the action scenes less interesting to look at too. They're not badly choreographed, there's only so much you can do when all of your fighters are flying bricks, but the fights in Man of Steel are to my mind a lot of visual noise and not much else. There are things I like that happen during the action sequences, but unlike some other movies, the actual fighting is just boring. I'm not really in the camp that holds the wanton destruction that results from the film's actions against Superman, even if it still makes no sense to me that that's not exactly how the populace in-universe reacts, but that's not really where my issue lies. It's just the visual, it's too much, man, it's destruction porn. More so than maybe any other movie of its kind. It's just overboard, and unlike your Independence Days or your Avengers, I don't get the sense that the narrative is trying to make any sort of point with it. It's just things blowing up and getting smashed for the sake of things blowing up and getting smashed. This applies less to the fight in Smallville, which is sprinkled with some nice character beats, than it does to the climax, which I feel is the worst victim of all in terms of scenes just not needing to be there. That seems to be a pattern with this movie. Like those scenes with Lois I mentioned, the final fight between Clark and Zod really isn't saying anything or getting anything in the story done. It's just flash, pomp, and circumstance. It's in destroying the baby trees on Zod's ship that Clark's character arc comes to an end, regardless of whether or not it makes any sense. You could have had Zod die in the explosion of that ship, and the story would have lost nothing for it. As I said earlier, I don't agree with the idea that Clark having to kill Zod informs his character going forward any. And it feels really unnecessary to me, especially because I don't think "Oh noes, I killed someone" works as a dramatic beat in this movie. Clark has already been complicit in the deaths of Zod's whole crew, and there's no evidence in this movie or in the future that not killing bad guys was ever part of Clark's ethos. So why am I meant to take it as a big deal when this specific version of Clark Kent kills Zod? He saved the day, the threat is gone, so why does Clark react like this? I can't just take it for granted that Clark was reared to value all life, even those of his enemies, nor can I assume that loss of non-innocent life is something Clark particularly cares about preventing. I know that's what everyone wants me to assume, but I can't because the movie doesn't give me anything to make that clear. That being the case, what is Clark proving to himself, Zod, the world around him, or the audience by snapping Zod's neck? And why is it worse than literally aborting a planet's worth of fetuses with his laser eyes? I've got nothing, and I don't think the movie has anything either. Especially since, and I know I'm a broken record, Batman v Superman completely fails to build on this. So yeah, the whole fight with Zod is just an excuse for fireworks on Snyder's end. I'm not sure why it was necessary since the past several minutes had already been packed with action and destruction and flashy visuals, but maybe there's just some satisfaction to having the conflict ultimately be settled by the hero and villain using their fists. On a primal lizard brain level, I suppose I can get it, but as a story beat, there's no reason to have it here. You don't even need it under the pretense that the mayhem they cause in Metropolis will factor into future movies, since there's plenty of destruction already by the time that the ship gets destroyed. Destruction which to the average Joe Schmo in Metropolis might as well be attributable to Superman until some kind of official statement comes out. Or until one of the Daily Planet folks, who are really the only individuals in the city who know Superman's identity, writes a story on it, and even then who's to say that people believe that? I honestly think the superfluousness of this fight and this death is a large part of what sours this movie on myself and many others. It's almost the signature scene of the film and goes on for quite a while, but could be cut entirely and never missed. As if to reflect my feelings on this movie, I feel almost as if I rushed through this review, and yet at the same time I've tackled a lot. Man of Steel is really, really close to being a passable movie in my opinion, or at least a very interesting and thought-provoking Superman story. The superficial things that bother me, like the oppressively gray palette and overwrought action, wouldn't amount to a hill of beans if only the movie had a better grasp on character, both by having better, more revealing dialogue and by understanding the darker implications of their actions. If there's one thing this movie knows, it's what it wants to be, but it can't quite get there because the narrative doesn't know what to focus on. It sucks that Batman v Superman is a sequel which made this film worse in hindsight instead of better, by failing to capitalize on the things about it that came closest to really working. There's a great Superman movie waiting to be made out of these disparate pieces, but it needed a few more passovers to meet that potential. I'm sorry. I said I was gonna do this a while ago, like, before summer started, and I'm just starting on it now in the middle of August. What's wrong with me? Okay, whatever, I'm keeping a checklist now, and I have no clue when this is gonna come out relative to other videos, especially since it might be pretty long, and Malik's gonna have to edit it, and I know he wanted me to do Teen Wolf first. I'm so sorry. Alright, okay, I'm cool, I'm fine. Crisis aside, here's hoping that you enjoyed the video, and regardless of anything else, that I at least made some semi-interesting points for you to think on. If so, why not discuss it in the comments, and maybe like this video and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in more content from me. If you'd like to hear me talk about anything in particular, lay a request down and I'll get to it in due time. So long and thanks for watching.